decision-making. And with those two questions in mind, we'll get going. First up is Paromita Nakshi. Paromita is a PhD student here at the University of Toronto, and her talk today is on a systematic literature review that she has been leading over the past year. The review covers the academic literature that has used survey research to measure transport poverty and transport-related social exclusion. And so with that, I'll just say the floor is yours, Paromita.
Thanks, Matt. Can you all see my slides and hear me? Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on surveys on transport poverty and transport-related social exclusion, systematic review of academic literature. So the aim of our study was to systematically review all studies that have been conducted or used an existing quantitative questionnaire survey to examine one or more of the following concepts as the outcome variable. The concepts, there are quite a few concepts because I think all of you were somewhat familiar with the thing that how concepts like transport poverty or transport-related social exclusion, mobility poverty, transportation justice, transportation equity, or transportation insecurity, all these concepts are often used interchangeably across academic literature, and different studies have defined these concepts in a little bit of different ways. So there are a lot of concepts that are somewhat similar or falls within the realm of our studies. So that's why we have considered all these different types of concepts that are somewhat similar and try to do a systematic review and find out that how academic literature have tried to address these concepts through quantitative questionnaire survey. So this is kind of a big list of keywords that we had used for our systematic review. I won't really go into the details of all these or really read this out because that will take a lot of time. But if anyone is interested later on, please feel free to reach out to us about the study or what are the keywords we used. But this is the these are the keywords that we use for our systematic review. And for our study purpose, we only focused on studies that was published in English and between the time frame of the year 2000 and towards the end of our study, like although it's like 2022, because we had been always revising our keywords and studies a bit. So it's like, I think the studies involve around early 2021. Early 2022. So we focused on studies that we found on Web of Science and Scopus. And at first we found 4,590 academic literature, including peer-reviewed journal papers, conference proceedings, and book chapters. And then we used Cobidence to remove the duplicates. And after removing the duplicates, we had 3,522 academic articles, and we screened the titles and abstracts of those papers. And after that, we excluded almost 3,000 records because they were not relevant to our study. And finally, we focused on 533 full text articles and assessed their eligibility. And when we were assessing their eligibility, we found that although a lot of papers from their title and abstracts, they seemed that they are aligning with our study purpose, but when we were actually reviewing the full text, we found that many of them basically focused on travel behavior, mode choice, this type of concepts. And the concepts that are related to transport poverty or social exclusion, they were more peripheral and not really the main aim of those papers. And so we excluded those and focused on the papers that had explicit focus on the concepts that I mentioned beforehand. And after that, finally, we had 158 full text articles that we use for data extraction. And today I will present some of the preliminary findings from those extracted data. Although it's not a completed study, we are still working on those, but we think that we have found some interesting findings that we can share with you and get your feedback. So let's see some of the major findings. First of all, you can see that this is the publication date of the distribution of these studies. And very clearly, in the last 3 years, there has been a noticeable increase in academic literature that focused on these concepts. Whereas like in 2004 or 2006 or 2000, within 2010, we had only a few articles. So I think this is something very exciting for people who are working in this field, because we are learning way more, and this is something that we are really interested in. Um, now let's see um, how all these papers have focused on different types of transportation modes. We have found that after 2013, the number of studies that measure transportation equity in active transportation has increased extensively, as you can see from the graph. And then some of the modes are related to more recent technologies like e-scooters or autonomous vehicles. And we found very few articles that focused on those modes. Um, or even on-demand transit, which is also kind of a buzzword these days. But I think we found that still there is not a lot of studies that are focusing on on-demand transits, equity, or social exclusion focus. Uh, this is an interesting chart, I think, that shows which population group have been focused in these studies more. And we have found that seniors and women have received greater attention in these studies compared with other population. And although a lot of studies focus on the general population as a whole and did not explicitly focus on a particular group, but apart from that, women and seniors were the groups that we found a lot of studies focused on. And at the same time, there were quite a lot of focus on people on low income, or people who are involuntarily careless, and people who have any kind of physical disability or mental health conditions. We try to focus on some of the barriers that the studies focused. Here I want to mention that many of the papers focused on multiple barriers, not just one barriers. But in this chart, we try to show you which barriers received greater attention. And as you can see that in recent years, safety is one of the barriers that have come across multiple times. And I think that kind of relates to our previous graph, that we found that women and senior population have received a lot of attention. And we know that women and seniors, they are one of the they're the groups that often deal with a lot of safety concerns when traveling, particularly in terms of using public transit or active transportation. And at the same time, built environment or physical environment, as well as barriers related to accessing different types of travel modes. These are also some of the barriers that we found have came up quite a few times. But interestingly, like cultural or social norms is one of the barriers that we didn't see coming up that much. That might be related to the fact that a lot of studies that you found are mostly focused on more developed countries or more in the global south, and like barriers related to cultural and social norms we found them more prominent in studies that focused on global north or more developing regions of the world. So that might be one of the reasons why we didn't find cultural or social norms coming up many times. Next, in terms of sample size, on an average, each study had more than 3,000 people investigated in each of the cases, but there were quite a few variations as well, particularly the studies that focused on the studies that used any national or regional survey. They definitely had a larger sample size, whereas studies that used surveys conducted by authors of this study, they definitely had relatively lower sample size. In terms of survey method, almost half of these studies used in-person survey methods, and quite a lot of them also had online surveys. And a lot of studies also adopted mixed methods like reaching out to people in person while also mailing the survey to some people, or mailing and using telephone surveys, this type of combination. When we focused on the unit of analysis that these surveys used, we found that frequency of mode uses came up more frequently. So these studies try to say that which modes are used more frequently, and which modes weren't used that much. Maybe people wanted to use that mode, but because of some of the barriers that we discussed before, they couldn't use the modes that frequently. Or sometimes studies try to compare as well. For example, people who have cars and people who are carless, what's their frequency of mode usage? Like, are they sharing cars more? Are they also using transit? Like, people who have cars, are they also using transit sometimes, or are they not using transit at all? This type of frequency of mode usage came up quite a few times. And at the same time, activity participation in terms of number of trips was another unit of analysis that we found used quite a few times, as in studies you try to compare how the number of trips varies by population groups, and if there are suppressed trips that people planned to make certain trips, but because of some kind of barriers, they missed those trips. This kind of comparison also were found in our analysis. Most of these studies were cross-sectional, and only a small segment of studies use longitudinal panel data. And yeah. So next, we will focus on some of the key areas, including suppressed travel, and then economic activity participation, and social and civic activity participation. So let's first see how suppressed travel has been addressed in academic literature. So we found that in total, 30 papers focused on suppressed travel out of 158 papers. And among suppressed travel, some papers focused on multiple areas that align close to suppressed travel. For example, missed medical appointments and missed social trips, or missed medical appointments and missed work trips, these kind of things. And whereas some papers focus particularly on just one component, or just in general how different activities were not being able to access by people. So we found that 7 papers focused explicitly on missed medical appointments, or people who had to stop medical treatment because of any kind of transportation barrier. And 26 papers focused on different other activities that were not completed, or any type of inability to travel. And as you can see, the reason why 26 plus 7, it is more than 30, is because some papers focused on multiple areas of suppressed travel. But at least what we from these findings, at least we can see that there has been a growing attention in the area of suppressed travel, whereas before, when transportation planning or transportation geography mostly focused on travel behavior or modeling kind of studies, suppressed travel was something that was kind of ignored, but nowadays suppressed travel is something that is gaining more and more attention. So 30 papers focusing on suppressed travel out of 158 is something quite noticeable in my opinion. So in terms of papers that focused on suppressed travel, we found that disability or any kind of physical or mental health condition, this population group was covered by 10 papers, that's the highest number. And then older adults or senior citizens, women, people on low income, and immigrants. These are the population group that were also covered under suppressed travel. However, population groups like children or rural population and small population living in small urban areas, those population groups appeared less frequently. And some papers also focused on the general population without any specific focus on one or more groups. And we also found that no study explicitly focused on Two-Spirit or LGBTQ IA population groups. So studies that focused on gender dimension, they typically focused on women. And this is something I think might be an area of interest for many of us, that academic literature isn't quite yet addressing the transportation needs, or if there is any suppressed travel occurring because of social norms or stigma surrounding the LGBTQ population. That is something possibly we need to focus more in future. So when we looked at the study area of these papers, we found that studies were mostly concentrated around the United States, Canada, and Australia, and other countries appeared way less frequently, maybe once or twice. And most of these studies used, the authors conducted their own survey to do these studies, and only a small number of papers, like less than 5, actually used any kind of national or regional survey. And that kind of, I think, indicates that still national and regional surveys around the world are yet to keep up with the importance of addressing suppressed travel or missed trips. And this is something, if we are planning for national surveys in future, this might be an area that we need to focus more. So some of the key findings that came from our study is that one study found that older adults reported missing 1/4 of their planned grocery trips in the past 2 weeks when the survey was conducted due to some kind of transportation problems. And more than 1/4 of ex-driver seniors wished to visit their nearby family or friends more, while around the same percentage wished to pursue their hobbies more, but they couldn't do that because of transportation barriers. And almost 1/4 of the low-income suburbanites were found to have missed or rescheduled a clinic appointment due to transportation problems at least once in their lifetime. And 4.6% older adults in rural and small urban areas missed or delayed routine healthcare checkups. And also, some people also had to miss their emergency care visits during the past year because of a lack of transportation. And more than 1/4 of seniors and people with disabilities missed healthcare appointments at least once in the past year because of unreliable transportation. So these are some of the noticeable findings from different studies, although we cannot really compare all those data in one scale because they focused on different time frames and conducted uh, in different countries or focused on different population groups. But one thing that is important is that suppressed travel is something really serious, because when we see that in whichever country or whichever population group, 1/4 of the people are not able to do whatever they wanted to do or are missing emergency healthcare trips, that is something really serious. and definitely points to the idea that suppressed travel is something we need to consider very seriously. And as you probably have seen a bit in the previous slides, these surveys adopted a wide variety of time frames. Some studies just asked people if they ever missed a clinic appointment due to transportation problems. No specific time frame, but ever in their lifetime. Whereas some questionnaire asked if they missed a delayed trip during the past year. And some studies asked if there was any missed trips during the past 14 days or 2 weeks due to transportation problems, as well as some studies focused on just the whole year. So there was a wide variety of timeframes used in these surveys. And next, we wanted to see how these questionnaires framed different types of questions or what type of scales or options were provided under different types of questions. For example, one study asked the respondents about the number of times in the past 12 months unreliable transportation prevented them from various activities. So it just asked the number of times. Again, one study asked, have you ever missed a clinic appointment because of transportation problems? So more like a yes, no type of question. Then in a typical month, how often do you have transportation problems? So you see, sometimes they're asking just about transportation problems, so more wider, wider language used. And sometimes they ask as in unreliable transportation. And some studies adopted a more open-ended question, that is, what is the main reason that you don't use the bus more often to travel to the clinic? And respondents could answer anything, any problem that they face. And again, one study, we found that they used Likert scale to gauge how often the respondents participate in different activities and if they wish to perform the activities more often. And in a scale of 1 to 3, where 1 is a lot more often and 3 as in not more often. So there are different types of questions and language used. So which is interesting, as well as it gives us a room to think that what type of question might give us better opportunities to gain more insightful information. So from these studies, we found that some of the common reasons of missing or rescheduling trips involved unreliable public transportation, limited public transit on weekends, difficulty accessing public transit, unaffordability, not having driver's license, prolonged travel time, request for paratransit service reservation denied, particularly for older adults and people living with disabilities, and family or friends unable to pick up. So that was about suppressed travel. Now let's focus on social and civic activity participation. We found 16 papers focused on this area, and multiple dimensions were explored. For example, barriers to socially specific trip making, like visiting family or friends, as well as impact of modal availability on trip making, like not having a car or unreliable public transit, preventing people from participating social and civic activity, as well as perceived importance of mode for trip making. So do people really feel that transit is, having a car is very important to make certain trips? And if they have that perceived importance, how that is affecting their social and civic activity participation. And in terms of the demographic groups, older adults were focused more, followed by general population, then people living in rural areas, people with disabilities, and newcomers or immigrant groups. And language consistency varies by type of social activity. This is somewhat a little bit similar to what we have seen in papers on suppressed travel, but here we found that when the questionnaire asked about visits with family and friends, the language were more specific, whereas in terms of more civic activity participation, like participating in hobby groups or sports clubs, the language were less consistent and a little more vague across different papers, and not as specific as it was for visits to family and friends. Um, so when we focused on the questions, we found that in this case of, well, different types of questions and languages were used. Some focused on more of an yes no type of question, like do you have any transport difficulties for any of these type of journeys, like social trips. And some studies use the Likert scale to um, see how important public transport is for meeting trips with family and friends. And as you can see that in terms of social activity participation as well, there is a significant number of people that highlighted that they have faced transportation difficulties when making any kind of social trips, or their social life was hindered by lack of transportation. Like almost 67% of people in one study, uh, people living with disability, to mention that access to transportation hindered their social life participation. And we also saw that drivers are way more likely to participate in hobby groups or different kinds of civic activity compared with people who do not have driver's license or cannot drive for any reason. So our preliminary conclusions in this case involves that visiting family and friends is the most common means of defining social visits in service. Literature that looked at other social activities like clubs and hobbies are less consistent. Mode availability matters greatly for social activity participation levels and satisfaction with those levels, particularly for people with disabilities, rural population, and older adults. And analysis for other demographic groups is relatively uncommon. And next, economic activity participation. 10 papers focused on this, and they focus mostly on whether any kind of transportation barrier uh, prevented people from choosing to take jobs or created difficulties. Did transportation difficulties ever cause people to leave their jobs and perceived level of job opportunities within commute distance, and any kind of difficulty reaching their workplaces? And demographics were mostly limited to general population and followed by rural population, then transit rider and people with disabilities. Language varies based on scope, population group, and aspect of job searching being studied. So in terms of the studies that focus in this area, we found that in this case as well, the language of these surveys varied definitely. Some studies ask like more of an yes no type of question, like has giving up transit made it harder to get to work? And 58% of the people said that yes, that was the case, which is a really high percentage. And did people ever have to leave their job offer because of travel difficulties? And 44% refused a job, so they got a job but could not avail that because of a transportation barrier. So it is somewhat clear that transportation barrier has some kind of influence in allowing people to avail their job opportunities. So these were some of the preliminary findings, and we are yet to get even more interesting findings as we work along more in this study. These were some of the studies that were cited in this presentation. And thank you so much. This was quite a brief overview of the findings and the study, but feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. And in this session as well, we are happy to receive your feedback to enrich our study even more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paramita. Definitely a systematic study in every sense of the word. I'll open up the floor now for questions. If anyone in our audience has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. And if there are none, I'll jump in and ask one. So Paramita, some of the earlier slides showed the overall breakdown of surveys conducted by population groups and by topic. Based on that cursory look, what do you think are some of the major gaps that you found, particularly in terms of whose needs we're asking about and where?
Thanks, Matt, for the question. I think this is something very important. One thing that I think really was not focused in these studies is newcomers or immigrant groups, whereas they often have some unique barriers like language or navigating a completely new system. So they probably face a lot of barriers that our current studies aren't adequately reflecting. And at the same time, we haven't seen a lot of studies that focused on mental health conditions, whereas different types of mental health conditions are really increasing. So we are not seeing a lot of studies that explicitly focused on cognitive barriers or how we can make public transit easier to navigate and this kind of things, whereas although we have seen focus on studies on people living with physical disabilities but not about mental health condition. So I think these are some of the areas that we need more focus on, and at the same time some explicit focus on race might be really important. We see often we say that there are a lot of incidents in transit or among pedestrians happening, like people who are visible minority, they feel unsafe. We read in newspapers they are being more attacked, but I guess that is something we need to focus more on, and our surveys need to explicitly focus whether race and mental health condition issues like this are being addressed.
Great, thanks. Up next is Sana and then Ahmed.
Hi, thank you,
Hi,
Paromita,
Sana.
for the really interesting presentation. I just wanted to understand that when you're talking about suppressed travel and social activity participation and economic activity participation, is it part of suppressed travel? Because it sounds like the flip side, right? If they're not participating, then their travel is kind of suppressed. And I also wanted to know if there are other categories like suppressed travel that you're working on to look at where literature review and studies have occurred. Thank you.
Thanks, Sana, for your questions. Yes, you were partially right in identifying that when we are talking about people are not able to avail certain opportunity or not participating in certain activity, it is within the concept of suppressed travel, but because of our study design, we are trying to find where the academic literature is focusing. So if they are not really talking about people missed trips or people's travel demand is suppressing, if that is not their explicit focus, if they are not framing these surveys or their study aim around that direction, we are not really thinking that they focused on suppressed travel. Maybe they're talking about how transportation barrier is affecting your economic life or social activity participation. So although they are kind of closely related, but it is more dependent on how the particular survey or particular study focused or what was their preliminary aim. But you are really right that a lot of studies, I mean, our overall study it was a bit of challenge to really differentiate and categorize studies across different groups, because these are not really clear-cut differentiation. These are not really straightforward. Things are kind of muddled. One study can really focus on multiple areas. So we really we focused on where these studies are really boiling down their focus on, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Paramita. And then we had one hand left from Ahmed.
So thank you so much for the presentation, and it's very interesting to see the work. And you're trying to cover a lot of ground here in that with the research that you're doing. And one of the problems I know exist, and I want you to highlight that for us, is how much inconsistency there is in how people are asking the questions, or how the inconsistencies. So when we say activity participation, the inconsistency in, did you see inconsistencies, for example, in some of the questions, or some of the research questions you're exploring? And if you saw, which ones were inconsistent? Because I know when I design a survey, it's going to be totally different from Catherine's design, and my language will be totally different, but we might be trying to measure the same thing. So how can you tell us more about what you found, and which areas you find the most inconsistent, that people are going very extremes in the language and things like that?
Thanks, Ahmed. Yes, that is an interesting question, and we also try to really focus on how these surveys try to conceptualize or what was the language used. And yes, we found that in some cases, the questions were really specific. They particularly said that, well, how often do you want to visit your friends and family more? If yes, with a like on a scale, like how, I mean, what's the severity that you want to visit them more? Whereas in some cases, like even the focus was way broader, like as in, is your social activity participation is hindered by any transportation problems? So in that case, they didn't really specify like what type of social activity were they trying to ask about, or were they also considering like hobbies, or participating in any kind of social groups is also a part of social activity, or are they really just narrowing down to friends and family? These things weren't particularly clear. And also in some cases, like in a lot of papers, we didn't have the questionnaires included. We had to like kind of infer from the tables and charts that they have, or when they provided an example under the methodology section, that this is the type of question we asked. So that is one difficulty we actually faced, that when we had at least the questionnaire at the end of the paper as an appendix, things were at least more straightforward. But in a lot of cases, we really kind of had to infer. And you were right that maybe two papers were inherently trying to address the same thing, but they were not exactly clear cut. So that is really one challenge that we are aware that we'll probably be facing as we'll dive deeper into this study.
Thank you so much, Paramita.
Thanks.